Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 133, Holiday Megasode. Alright, so I mentioned last week that I was taking this week off from podcast work so I could get ready to celebrate Christmas with my family, but I didn't want you to go without a podcast. Instead, I decided to use something I've seen a lot of other shows do during this time of year and go with a Megasode. For us, that means we're going back to two of the most listened to, most requested for replay episodes we've done in the history of this show. First up, we're going to drop in the second episode of this show that we ever did, and that's the history of Dungeons & Dragons. And for the record, this is an episode that's due for a revamp at some point, since I've changed the way I do research a lot since then. And if you listen to some of the quality parts of that episode, yeah, we've improved quality as well over time. Alright, so next after that, we've got the episode we did on the Arcane Magazine poll of the 50 most popular role-playing games of all time. I am specifically including it in today's Megasode because I wanted to give other role-playing games the love they deserve, and I know that we frequently seem to be D&D heavy. So, since we're covering the history of the industry leader to start the show, it seems only fair to give other games in the fandom some love for the end of the show. So I hope you enjoy the choices I made for this week's show, and I'll be back after the end of the Arcane poll portion of the show to wrap things up. Welcome to Role-Playing History, the podcast where we examine the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for this tour. Episode 2, the granddaddy of them all. Last week we examined the inspiration for role-playing games, which were war games. During that discussion, I noted that the 1971 release of the war game rules Chainmail, written by Gary Gygax, led to the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. I further noted the importance of the Chainmail rules because of how many of those rules formed the basis of D&D, which, by the way, is what I'm going to be calling it from this point on. Fewer words, less to type, less to say. You can appreciate it. And listen, all of the smart-ass jokes I made last week aside, when you mention a role-playing game to the average person, D&D is what they think of. Released in 1974, D&D has been published non-stop ever since, through 3 companies, 6 editions. I say 6 editions because I consider edition 3.5 to be its own separate edition, and a ton of controversies. D&D is still widely accepted to be the most widely played role-playing game in the world. However, the history of its creation is not without controversy all its own, and the plan here is to clear up as much of it as we can while still remaining respectful to all of those involved. Now, the simple history of the creation of D&D usually goes like this. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, being the avid medieval wargamers that they were, got together to create the role-playing game we now know as Dungeons & Dragons. To quote Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's true from a certain point of view. The whole story is a hell of a lot more complicated. So, let's get into it. It is true that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were both very avid wargamers. Various interviews and biographical pieces on both men have detailed their love for medieval wargames. Each man had his own game that he ran, with several friends being parts of their different groups. However, the genesis for D&D isn't in 1971 with the creation of Chainmail, like I reported last week. It actually goes back 3 years earlier with Dave Arneson. Now again, according to multiple sources, Dave Arneson was what I would define as a genuine game innovator. Sure, he loved war games, but he was one of those people who never seemed to be happy with the rules that he could get his hands on to use for a game. So he was constantly tinkering with the rules in an attempt to have his game be exactly what he wanted it to be. He also made it a point to share what he was doing with other wargamers by publishing his changes in various wargamer magazines. His friends, who were helping him with his rule changes, did the exact same thing. So, In 1968, Arneson's friend David Wesley invented a game called Braunstein, which was a Napoleonic-era war game. This game had several new innovations in it. First off, it mandated a referee, which we discussed in last week's episode. It had been a part of military war games for a really long time, but had never really been a part of commercial or home games. The second major change was that players had to play as individuals rather than entire units of soldiers. Again, this was a big change because wargaming had always been 2 players, with each player in charge of a large number of units, or maybe 4 players, again, in charge of units. A unit being 10, 20, 30, 40 of a particular thing. So it was 1 player, 1 character. It wasn't really called a character, but that's what it evolved into. And this was a totally new idea. Then Arneson, with Wesley's blessing, expanded on Braunstein, creating Blackmore. So while that was going on, let's take a half a step back and see what Gary Gygax was doing. Now, Gygax did write and publish Chainmail in 1971. However, it's been noted by several authors that Chainmail was not a wholly original work. In a classic gamer move, Gygax expanded on rules that were originally created by Jeff Purvin. However, and I cannot stress this enough, Chainmail was not a role-playing game. It was always intended to be a better set of medieval rules for wargaming. Shortly after Chainmail's release, Gygax did create a supplemental set of rules that added some of the things that we'll see later on in D&D, like armor class and hit points. It should also be noted that that set of rules was based on Lord of the Rings, Conan the Barbarian, and other fantasy works that he enjoyed, and you might want to write that down as a note, because we're going to come back to that a little later on. Arneson soon got a hold of Chainmail and the supplemental rules, and he expanded Blackmore, folding in some of what he had enjoyed from Chainmail, and then adding some of his own twists. He added things like character classes, experience points, and level advancement, and those were just 3 of many ideas that he added to Blackmore over time. Also, and this is a big break from his wargaming past, he didn't really use miniatures. I mean, he had maps for his games to show where you were and where you were going, but everybody who played Blackmore has stated that it was always intended to be what's known as theater of the mind. By all reports, Blackmore was much more like D&D than Chainmail had ever been. Well, eventually, Gygax was invited to play in Arneson's Blackmore game. These 2 men did know each other. They'd worked together on some wargame rules once before. By all reports, Gygax fell in love with the game and asked Arneson for a copy of the rules. Now, this is where things get interesting. Arneson didn't really have a printed set of rules. In fact, those closest to him at the time have reported that Arneson never really organized his rules into a coherent document. He did have his big 3-ring binder of notes, but as somebody who's been running games for a long time, I can tell you, just because you have the binder doesn't mean anyone else can understand what the hell you wrote down in it. So, Gygax convinced Arneson to allow him to organize the rules into a more digestible format, which he did, adding some of his own thoughts and ideas as he went along. Now, to this point, everything still seemed to be good with the relationship between Arneson and Gygax. However, and sadly, this would not continue to be the case. In 1974, the first edition of D&D was published, giving creative credit to both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Editions of the first printing were literally assembled in Gygax's kitchen, with actual wooden boxes getting stickers hand put on them to identify the game. And on a side note, one of those first-run editions recently sold at an auction for $66,000 US. It should also be noted that in this first run, you had to buy Chainmail because you needed the Chainmail rules in order to manage combat. Oh, and backing up a half a step, Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR for short, had been formed in 1973 by Gygax and a fellow by the name of Don Kay to specifically handle the publication and distribution of D&D. And on a further side note, I mean, hell, we're already headed in the weeds. Let's just continue the trip. The first game released by TSR was a miniatures game called Cavaliers and Roundheads. It was released specifically to make money that they could use for D&D's release. As TSR geared up for the D&D release, a fellow named Brian Bloom joined the company with the express purpose to help drum up the financing needed to print the game. Obviously, he succeeded, and the first run was 1,000 games. They were priced at $10 US each. Oh, and to buy the dice that you'd need, it'd be another $3.50. Everything sold out in 10 months. So, in early 75, they tried again, printed another 1,000. Sold out 6 months. Now, around this time, Dave Arneson joined TSR to help out with marketing, and later in 75, another 2,000 copies were printed. They sold out in 5 months. Okay, so let's step back and check this for a second. From January 1974 to roughly March of 1976, 4,000 copies of D&D were produced and sold. Nowadays, there are those who might see that as a major defeat. But you have to remember that this was not only a brand new game, but it was a brand new style of game. So to move 4,000 copies in right about 2 years, that's astounding. Another note from 1975, the Greyhawk supplement was released. Credited to Gygax and Robert J. Kuntz, it was actually a printing of the rules they were using in their home game with new character classes, spells, and monsters that hadn't been in the original core game. And for the long-time gamers that listen, this is where the Thief and Paladin classes were first published, as well as the first time we ever got 7th, 8th, and 9th level spells. However, Gygax intentionally put nothing about the actual setting of Greyhawk into this book, and there are two schools of thoughts on why. One, it was assumed players would want to create their own campaign worlds to play in. Well, of course they would. Why are you just going to run something that I created for you? We'll get to that in a minute. Two, Gygax didn't want to spill all his secrets, both from a financial and a creative standpoint. After all, would the money he made be worth having to create a whole new setting for the players he was running games for all the time? Maybe, maybe not. It's also important to note not only that Greyhawk was the first D&D supplement, it was really the first game supplement ever printed. I mean, before this, if you wanted to change or alter some rules, you basically just wrote up a whole new set of rules. Supplements just weren't heard of. I mean, the closest thing to a gaming supplement in the wargame-only time would be maybe an article or two where you printed some thoughts on some game ideas that you've been trying out. That's it. Next up, Arneson got the chance to bring Blackmore to the world. Sort of. I mean, the Blackmore supplement was released later in 1975, but it had nothing about the actual Blackmore setting in it. Kind of like what Gygax did with Greyhawk. What it did have were two new classes, the Assassin and the Monk, as well as new rules for underwater combat. Even better, Blackmore included the first ever published RPG adventure, The Temple of the Frog. Now, it's been asked why Arneson didn't publish setting information for Blackmore, and unlike Gygax, Arneson doesn't really seem to get the same harsh treatment from historians or critics or whatever we're calling them. It's believed by many that the reason for him not doing so is twofold. One, he was rather notorious about being, let's just say, not the best at keeping track of where he put things. In fact, it's been reported that the final draft of Blackmore had been lost for a couple of weeks before it was found and finally submitted. Second reason, there are those who believe that even if Arneson wanted to print setting information, after Gygax chose not to do so with Greyhawk, there was probably no way that Gygax, who was a TSR owner, was going to allow Arneson, who wasn't a TSR owner, to print setting information about Blackmore when he himself did not publish setting information about Greyhawk. Now, I can't stress enough. This is just a theory from a few people that were around TSR at the time. They admit that this is a theory they've pieced together from information here and information there, and never anything they actually heard from Gygax himself. I'm including it here just to provide a complete thought on the record. Anyway, by the end of 1975, both Gygax and Arneson had put rules from their own adventures out, and D&D was well on its way to changing the gaming world. I guess it'd be a shame then if something controversial came along. Oh, look, something controversial came along, because of course it did. This one's a pretty big one, too. Remember when I told you a few minutes ago to note something about Gygax's influence by Lord of the Rings? Yeah, well, the halflings, elves, dwarves, orcs, rangers, and such that were a part of D&D caused the Tolkien estate to take issue with D&D. In fact, the halfling was originally just straight up called a hobbit. That, along with the Ent and Balrog, yes, those were actually in the original game as well, were direct ties to Tolkien works and were changed to avoid legal issues. And while Gygax had played down the influence for decades, in 2000 he finally admitted the influence that Tolkien's work had had on the creation of D&D. Another controversy at this time was in the artwork being used for Greyhawk and several of Gygax's other works. Greg Bell was Gygax's artist of choice. However, Gygax had a habit of contacting Bell very late in the creative process. Now, if you're any sort of creative type, you understand just how important it is to have plenty of time to create. Well, with short timelines to get his work created, Bell would occasionally copy figures from comic books. One of the most infamous is the sword-wielding warrior on the cover of the Greyhawk supplement. He got that from a 1974 issue of Eerie, and the original is called Dax the Damned. You can actually Google it and see the picture. Now, my research into the artwork didn't turn up any legal challenges to these behaviors, but the fact that they happened and are basically acknowledged to have happened is a telling sign for things to come, and it is the reason why I've included it here. By the way, as a note, moving forward, I'm not going to note when every single D&D product was published. I mean, geez, if I did that, we need about a week's worth of podcast to list everything, and I really don't think Wizards of the Coast wants to pay me for that. However, if you work for Wizards of the Coast and you are willing to pay me to do that, hit me up at the email. I give it at the end of the show. What I will be doing is noting significant historical releases. My hope is that brings us in somewhat under an hour. I don't know, but let's get on with it. So with all of that in mind, 1977 is the next big historical date. This is when the original D&D basic set was published. This was that iconic red box so many of us got started on. It was designed for players to play D&D from levels 1 to 3, along with just enough of the rules to get new players up and running. It should also be noted that this set was written by John Eric Holmes, who chose to write in a more open, improvisational style of gaming, as opposed to Gygax, who wanted rules for everything that could possibly happen in a game. The basic set was the beginning of a 23-year split of the brand. The basic set was called D&D, while the Monster Manual, which was released shortly thereafter, was the first part of what was known as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, heretofore known as AD&D. The thought process was, at least according to historians, this. The basic set was going to be the thing to get the novice players in the door. After all, with its impressive art design, plus the fact that it was in a box, it meant it could be stocked at toy stores, put in a game section. And by the way, that's where I got my first copy of the basic set as a 10-year-old in 1983. AD&D would be, and was designed for, experienced gamers. Again, Gygax wanted to have rules for all the issues that could ever potentially come up, and in his mind, it just had to make sense that experienced gamers were going to be the ones that were going to want that. Something else that happened along this time was that Dave Arneson left TSR. In fact, as the D&D, AD&D split began, Arneson's name was on the D&D product as a creator, but not the AD&D material. This would prove to be a problem, as part of Arneson's agreement with TSR was royalty payments on all D&D products. TSR's argument was that due to how different AD&D was, well, it wasn't Arneson's game anymore, so he didn't deserve any royalties. I think you can guess how well that went. Arneson filed 5 separate lawsuits between 1979 and 1981. And in fairness, all he wanted is what he was promised. In March of 1981, Arneson and Gygax came to an agreement. Arneson and Gygax would be credited as the co-creators on all D&D products, and Arneson would get a 2.5% royalty on all AD&D products moving forward. Arneson then dropped the suits. I would love to say that this ended all the beef between these two guys, but it didn't. But it is the end of their beef for this episode. So getting back into the timeline, the AD&D Player's Handbook was released in 1978 and the Dungeon Master's Guide in 1979. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking of these dates going, how in the hell does it make sense to release the 3 core books over a 3-year span? And while we're at it, why do you release the Monster's Manual first, before the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide? And I'm going to be honest, it didn't make any sense to me either. But for TSR in the late 70s, apparently it did work. They sold a lot of copies, and they made a lot of money. But I would consider this to be yet another entry in that category of signs of things to come. In 1980, Greyhawk came to AD&D. The difference this time is that Gygax actually put campaign setting information into the supplement. In fact, Greyhawk would be the default setting for a number of supplements throughout the life of AD&D. 1984 brought Dragonlance, which proved to be a whole lot more than just a campaign setting. It was also a series of best-selling novels that are actually among the best-selling fantasy novels of all time. This setting is also very different from what had been previously published, and I really can't do it justice trying to explain it. Pick up one of the novels, you get a really good idea about what the setting's like. Also, during this time, the D&D portion of the brand got an expert set for levels 4 through 14, followed later by the companion rules for levels 15 through 25, the master rules for levels 26 through 36, and immortal rules. That's when your group is basically God. Hardcore gamers might remember these as the blue, teal, black, and gold boxes. And yes, you could still get them in toy stores. I will speak from experience because that's where I got them. Each one of these boxes expanded the rules for players and brought new races, classes, spells, and adventures to the game. There was also the fact that the divide was expanded and promoted between D&D and AD&D. I mean, originally it was thought that after you leveled out on the basic set, you'd just kind of shift over to AD&D. Now that idea had been discarded, and exactly what was gonna happen was, In 1985, the title Oriental Adventures was released. Now, at the time, it was a well-received, widely used source, both for setting and for the materials inside of it. Today, it finds itself in a bit of controversy, beginning with its name. And inside the book, there are a number of references that are considered to be racist, insensitive, or just generally inappropriate. However, there are those who still love this setting, they still appreciate this setting, and still work to bring it into the modern editions of Dungeons & Dragons. Hey, while we're speaking of controversies, this is probably a good place to discuss the batch of controversies D&D found itself in the 1980s. Christian groups, parental groups, the media. D&D seemed to be getting hit from all sides. Christian groups tended to hit D&D with that brush of Satanism. And while there were a number of different reasons why, more often than not, it's because of the fact that devils and demons were monsters that were usable in the Monsters Compendium. Mind you, they weren't playable characters. They were the monsters you were supposed to destroy. And there were some religious groups that thought it was mighty, I don't want to say satanic, but blasphemous would probably be another way to put it, that we have clerics and paladins, these holy warrior type of characters, but they're not, just to be blunt, they're not worshiping the Christian God. And again, that was blasphemous or satanic, or you get the point. Parental groups used some of these same tactics, though they and the media would add witchcraft to the mix. I have no idea how the hell they came up with that. I mean, I get that there were a lot of spells that characters could cast in the game, but witchcraft? Really? Now, if a parental group was complaining about the artwork, you might be able to argue they had a case. I mean, holy crap. Chainmail bikinis were in like every issue, and a lot of bare breasts on the monster types, and a lot of skin shown on the females. And you know what? I'll give the parental groups that one. If they want to have a complaint about the artwork, I'll give them that one. Look, I'll fully admit that the artwork of first and second edition could be sexist or sexual from time to time. No doubt. However, I would like to throw a plug out here if I can. Jolly Blackburn, who's the author, creator of Knights of the Dinner Table, he has skewered this subject on so many different occasions. Trust me, check out his backwork, kenzerco.com. It's hilarious, it pokes fun, and it kind of gives you a reason to understand why so many people thought that stuff was just so sexualized. And yes, by today's standards, definitely wrong. Hell, I could almost argue by those standards in the 80s it was wrong. But anyway, another controversy magnified by the media was a series of accusations that D&D led people to suicide or even murder. There were several somewhat high-profile cases in the 1980s, and one of them even led to a movie called Mazes and Monsters, which, by the way, starred a fairly young Tom Hanks. The overall point of the movie was that people got hung up on the fantasy aspect of D&D and lost their grip on reality. This was also the point that some tried to make in the suicide and murder cases. Look, I'm just going to stop this crap right here. D&D isn't responsible for murders and suicide any more than listening to Metallica or Ozzy Osbourne would be. Unfortunately, a lot of those claims come from people who didn't want to believe that their loved ones could have possibly done what they did. And look, I am very sympathetic to those who lose loved ones, but throwing crap at the wall to see what sticks is not the best way to get the answers you're looking for. And another thing we need to consider, role-playing games do not cause mental health issues. In fact, I have personally seen them help kids with mental health issues, as well as kids and adults with serious social disorders. Okay, I get it. At this point, you're going to be like, all right, big man, what are your bona fides on that? Spent 5 years working with kids in special education classes and 10 years working in the field with mental health consumers. I'm not going to try to toot my own horn here. You know what? Hell with it. Yeah, I'm going to toot my own horn with this one. In this case, I know exactly what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, off the soapbox, back into the history. In 1986, Gary Gygax sold his shares in TSR and left the company. Now, I'm going to cover all this more next week when we do a deep dive into TSR, but for now, we need to understand that from this point moving forward, D&D and AD&D were left without either of their creators overseeing the day-to-day development. One of the most popular settings in D&D was released for AD&D in 1987, The Forgotten Realms. This setting has produced a number of supplements, many of which are still considered to be some of the best the game has ever produced, novels, video games, and yeah, by the way, it is still selling a ton of product in the 5th edition, because yeah, of course they updated it for 5th edition. 1989 was another milestone year. This is when 2nd edition AD&D was released. Now, learning their lesson from the initial AD&D release, the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and 3 volumes of what they were now calling the Monstrous Compendium were released at basically the same time, giving gamers the opportunity to start the new and updated rules immediately. Also, in yet another sign of things to come, the titles The Complete Fighter's Handbook and The Complete Thief's Handbook were released. I say in another sign of things to come because before 2nd edition came to an end in 2000, the Complete series included a volume on every race, every class, just about every spell. Look, basically anything anybody writing for TSR and later Wizards of the Coast could come up with. And with a price running about $25 to $35 US each, TSR made a ton of money off of me. I mean, them. Yeah, them. One more big item from 1989 was the space-centric setting called Spelljammer, Now, I have to admit, I have never played this setting, but I know a lot of people who swear by it, and they've actually worked on their own to make sure this setting gets updated every time a new edition of D&D is released. To me, that says a lot for what it means to the people who love it. In 1990, D&D went into gothic horror with the Ravenloft setting. While it wasn't as successful as Forgotten Realms, quite seriously, what was, it had and still has a very loyal group of supporters. Again, this is a setting that has seen itself being updated for each new edition of D&D, either by Wizards of the Coast or by the fans themselves. By the way, I know you're wondering, what is Wizards of the Coast? I'll get into that in a minute. Just stay with me. The Dark Sun setting was released in 1991. It brought a low-magic, post-apocalyptic setting to D&D, set in a hostile desert world. Again, the loyal fans of this setting have made sure it gets updated for new systems, even though it really didn't do major business when it was initially released. Al-Qadim was released as a setting in 1992, bringing a Middle Eastern feel and flair to D&D. Now, maybe it was the timing in which it was released, maybe it was the beginning of a setting fatigue, but the sales on this setting were also low, which led to it getting fewer supplement releases than the previous settings. However, as I've said more than once in the last 3 minutes or so, it has a very loyal following. You get the point. The final new setting for AD&D came out in 1994. Called Planescape, it had a very crossing the planes of existence kind of vibe to it. Again, the sales were okay, but not overwhelming. But like several of the previous settings, it has a support group that swears by it and makes sure it gets updated with every new edition. Now, I mentioned something about setting fatigue when I was talking about Al-Qadim. This is something that gets argued about from time to time in the gaming community. There's a side to this argument that believes that the more different kinds of settings that you have for your game, the more potential gamers you can bring in. The flip side of this argument is that by having so many settings, eventually gamers will quit caring so much about your releases and will just choose the setting that they like the best, and that you're basically just shooting your business in the foot. I personally don't take one side or the other on that one. I'm just explaining the argument to you so you understand what I'm talking about with it. By the mid-1990s, the argument could very easily be made that TSR was shooting itself in the foot from a business standpoint. But again, we'll deep dive all of that next week when we talk about TSR. But the result of the business mismanagement is that in 1997, Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR. See, I told you I'd get to that. This was an absolute bombshell announcement, even though there had been rumors floating around the internet at the time. Role-playing gamers were concerned at the time about the purchase, as Wizards was known primarily for collectible card games, like Magic the Gathering, which I know you've heard of that, and it was a very successful game. However, the concerns turned out to be unfounded. Wizards did make some adjustments to the teams and submission procedures and the like, but otherwise they really just continued to promote the hell out of AD&D and D&D. In fact, probably stronger than TSR had been able to do so previously, and the games just kept rolling on without missing a beat. Fast forward to 2000, two huge announcements were made. The first concerned the purchase of Wizards of the Coast by Hasbro. Yeah, that Hasbro. Again, the gaming community expressed concern that this purchase would lead to the end of gaming as we know it. And again, this was proven to not be true. Okay, it wasn't proven to be completely true. And the reason for that is because of the other major announcement. D&D 3rd edition was released to the public, with all 3 books being released within a 3-month period. Now, while I was really critical of the AD&D release schedule initially, I wasn't critical of this release for a big reason. The 3rd edition of D&D set the game on its head. I mean, they changed everything. Races and classes were updated and changed. The armor class system was completely overhauled. Attacks and damage were changed. I mean, they literally did a full-on top-down change of the gaming system. So when Wizards announced it, they did gamers what I consider a great service. They released a free conversion piece that would assist players in trying to convert their AD&D characters to 3rd edition. Spoiler alert, it wasn't easy. It went way beyond square peg round hole and more like trying to play football with a golf ball. And no pads. Or helmets. And low light. In other words, it was more often than not easier to just completely redo your character and try to fit the spirit of what your previous character could do, rather than try to match everything up equally. I mean, the skills were different, proficiencies were different. It was hard. But the positive out of all of this was that we no longer had 2 games under the umbrella. AD&D and D&D were rolled into one game under one umbrella, and we were back to one name for the game, Dungeons and Dragons. And despite all my bitching, once we got used to this new system, I got to admit, we were absolutely in love with it. In fact, had myself and another of my hardcore gaming friends not been such the charming SOBs that we are, we'd still be playing 3rd edition in my regular group instead of 5th edition. But that's a completely different story for a whole nother day. Oh, and I should point out, Greyhawk was the official setting for 3rd edition, and almost immediately the Forgotten Realms were brought into this new edition as well. Copious amounts of material were released for both settings in order to make gamers feel more comfortable in the new system. And we were looking forward to seeing what these new rules could do in the long term. So, of course, Wizards announced an update. In 2003, Wizards announced what they called Edition 3.5. Now, in the books themselves, they called it a minor update, with an incorporation of hundreds of rule changes, mostly minor, and an expansion to the core rulebooks. I call bullshit. And I do apologize for the profanity. I call it because the fact that it was given an edition number tells me, as it told a number of others, by the way, that the changes being made were significant enough to be considered a new version. One argument was that they just could have completed a reprint of the books with the adjustments made if all they really were minor changes. In my opinion, they should have just called it 4th edition. That's why I said D&D has had 6 editions when I was talking about it earlier. But I'm digressing and going on the old man, you get off my lawn kind of rant, so let's just get back into the timeline. Around this time, a lot of folks were asking for another campaign setting. And quite frankly, most of those folks were hoping it'd be one of their favorites from 2nd edition, like Dark Sun or Ravenloft or Spelljammer. However, Wizards went another direction, announcing a $10,000 contest to create a brand new campaign setting for D&D. In 2004, the winner of this contest was released to the public. Eberron was its name, and it brought several new ideas to the D&D game, including the Dragonborn, which are still a part of the game today. Eberron has continued to be an official D&D campaign setting, getting updates for both the 4th and 5th editions from Wizards. Fast forwarding to June 6, 2008, Wizards had another big announcement to drop. 4th edition of D&D was released to the world, with all 3 of the core rulebooks, that's Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual, being released on the same day. And while this was a big shift from the previous edition, it wasn't as huge a change as the one from 2nd edition to 3rd. However, there was one change that was made that turned out to be way controversial with a whole lot of gamers. This was the addition of powers, which were special things that each character could do on their turn, and it had a variety of different flavors. It allowed for each class to be able to be so varied that you could literally have a party of 10 wizards, and they would all be completely different. Also, the thing with the powers was that it would let you just do this special little thing that only a wizard could do, or only a fighter could do. And it allowed for a variety of different things that your character could do depending on the situation. However, the controversy around powers seemed to link back to Hasbro as well. A number of gamers accused Hasbro of trying to turn D&D into a computer game. I mean, I lost track of the number of times I heard somebody talk about D&D turn into a hack and slash Monty Hall computer game. I didn't necessarily believe that to be true, but boy, were some of these people convincing. Side note, A hack and slash game is one based almost exclusively on fighting and killing everything in sight. Not a lot of role play, if any. Not a lot of heavy thought involved. It's basically, me big guy with sword, go kill. Monty Hall, that's Haul, not Hall, like the old host of Let's Make a Deal. Yeah, if you don't know who that is, just toss it in Google. When you're done, you'll figure it out. Anyway, a Monty Hall game is a game where characters get a whole lot of treasure for not a whole lot of work. In other words, a lot like some video games where you can max out your treasure take if you know how to work the system. In the case of a Monty Hall D&D game, the work of the game really is just the DM setting it up to give you a whole lot of stuff for next to nothing. As you may have already figured out, opinions about 4th edition tend to be one extreme or the other, without a whole lot of variables in the middle. The group that loved it absolutely loved it, and they really don't understand why the haters want to hate. Many of them, in fact, absolutely refused to update to 5th edition. While some of them decided, okay, you know what, I'll be loyal, I'll update, but they took the parts of 4th edition that they really, really loved, figured out how to tweak them into 5th edition, and just brought them right on into the game with them. The group that hated it used the hack and slash Monty Hall argument that I mentioned before. For them, the addition of the powers is their proof. Or Hasbro's supposed influence on Wizards and the game is their proof. And damn it, they're not going to give an inch of ground on this. These folks basically refused to play 4th edition and went back to 3rd edition, 3.5 edition, and played it until 5th edition released, because that was it. It was their own silent form of protest. Or for a lot of people I know, not really that silent. Personally, I have to admit I kind of liked 4th edition, but I couldn't get my regular group into it. I did run a campaign for my nieces and their friends at the time, and they loved it. So, I mean, maybe this had something to do with your age and your gaming experience. I'm not sure about that, but I will say that in my opinion, the big reason it wasn't as successful as Wizards had hoped it would be was Wizards had also announced a huge online support for this game when the edition came out. This was supposed to be like an online character sheet, the ability for dungeon masters to build their encounters, and even more importantly, the ability to play D&D online with your friends with the adventures you created. Unfortunately, that whole online suite just never really came together. And I think a certain amount of that is going to have to be because of the limitations of the internet or the systems at the time. And yeah, maybe that's a bit of a naive, optimistic view, but you know what? That's the view I'm going to take. Period. So, after all of that, let's spring ahead to 2014. 5th edition was released to the world, and again, all 3 core rulebooks came out on the same day. And again, there were some big differences between editions, including the removal of some of those more controversial things, including the powers from 4th edition. There were other changes that were made as well, but they didn't really impact the game as much as those changes that were made for 4th edition. Another huge support for this 5th edition is called D&D Beyond, and that's the official online support for the game, which, by the way, everybody can use for free. It has a character builder, a Dungeon Master's Encounter builder, and digital dice. Also has an app you can use on your phone or tablet to go paperless if you so choose. Now, they still don't have the online game thing quite down, but due to a whole lot of programs developed since 4th edition came out, it's not really as big a deal as it was previously. Oh, and by the way, this is the point where I have to mention that no, Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro, they're not paying me a dime for this to talk about their stuff. I talk about it because I use it and I love it. So, there you go. For me, I fell in love from 5th edition basically from the minute I first read it. It made character creation really easy. It allowed for easier customization of characters, which the other systems allowed, but sometimes made it a hell of a lot more difficult to do. For my money, this is the game that I would use to teach someone who's never gamed how to play D&D. And Wizards has taken the opportunity to tap into other popular phenomenons with this edition, releasing special editions tied to the Netflix hit Stranger Things and the popular cartoon Rick and Morty. 5th edition is also the edition that is most often used when watching a D&D live stream. Yes, those exist. I'm going to talk all about them in another show. And we've continued to see the increase in gaming over the years. So much so that in 2020, during the pandemic, Wizards reported an increase of 85% in people reported gaming. They also saw an increase in sales during a time that other businesses were seeing a significant decrease, which to me kind of makes sense. After all, tell a bunch of gamers we can't leave the house, and the first thing we're going to do is figure out how to play a game. In the case of my group, we used Discord and Roll20. Again, those are systems I'll talk about down the line. And this allowed us to keep our game rolling for about a year when we weren't able to play face-to-face at somebody's house. So, as we talk about D&D in 2021, it's estimated that about 48 million people play the game around the world. It's been around for 47 years, seen 6 editions, and 2 really lousy movies. By the way, that might be about to change, as a new movie is currently in pre-production, with release coming in late 2022 or early 2023. Hell, if the podcast is still around by then, I'll do a full review of it. And we've got celebrities coming out of the woodwork to just announce their fandom for D&D. So it's finally cool to take your gamer geek flag and raise that sucker all the way up the pole. In my mind, you can't ask for more than that. So that's it for this week's tour. Next week, we're going to take a half step back and do a deep dive into the history of TSR so that you can really understand how good they and the gaming world had it and see how bad it went real fast. But before we go, I want to take a minute to do a little bit of housekeeping. First, I wanted to thank everybody for the kind words about last week's episode, and a special shout out to my buddy Shane Welker for reminding me to introduce myself, since I got in this huge hurry last week and just kind of forgot. And I did want to say, I did hear everybody when you suggested I use a little theme music, but I spent a couple days surfing the internet looking for royalty-free stuff, and I really didn't see anything I liked. So until I can find a band or a singer-songwriter that's willing to work with me and help me out, we're just going to leave the show themeless, and I'll keep looking. Maybe I'll come up with something. Maybe I'll just play the harmonica real bad for a few minutes. I don't know. We'll figure it out. One more thing that was pointed out to me last week and was made even more obvious this week, I realized I've been using a lot of gamer talk. I've been using terms like armor class, experience points, and the like. And while I know there's a lot of gamers that listen to this, I also know there's folks listening who are more of a history-oriented type, or frankly, friends and family of mine that don't really game, but they're listening to this because it's a product I'm putting out, and they may not get all the terms. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drop a bonus episode for you. So coming up, this coming Tuesday, June 8th, I'm going to drop a bonus episode where I try to explain some of these terms to you. That's Tuesday, June 8th, right about 11 a.m. Central Time. Now, you're still going to get your TSR show next Friday, June 11th, about 11 a.m. Central Time. Not going to hose you out of that. So just make sure you follow us wherever you get your podcasts, as we are just about everywhere, except iTunes, and I can't figure out what their deal is, but I'm still working on it. Hopefully next week I can announce that we're on iTunes. We also have a Facebook page, so you can stop by Roleplaying History on Facebook to leave comments, or if you just really want to be a part of the family we're trying to build there. By the way, if you go in and try to leave a comment and you have issues, send a request. I'll take care of it. I'm approving them as soon as they come in, or at least as soon as I get notifications they're coming in. And as always, you can drop us an email at roleplayinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. I'm taking comments or questions about this show. I'm also taking ideas for future shows, and you never know what we might work out. So, with all the business done, I'll see you Tuesday at 11 a.m. for the bonus episode, next Friday at 11 a.m. for the deep dive on TSR. So until next time, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Roleplaying History. Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 86, Arcane Magazine's Top 50 Role-Playing Games of All Time. This week's topic comes from the habit I have on this show of referring to the poll Arcane Magazine did back in 1996 of its readers to come up with the list of the 50 most popular role-playing games of all time. Seems like I'm noting where the games I'm covering finished on that list on an almost weekly basis, and by now the poll's almost 27 years old. So I figured if I'm going to keep referencing it, maybe we should take a closer look at it and see not only what all is on it, but maybe try to figure out exactly how accurate it is. And to do that, we need to dig a little bit deeper into how popular of a magazine Arcane was. With that said, let's crank up the tour bus and get to today's topic. We can't dive into the list without first doing a little background on Arcane Magazine. Much like last week's episode, I wasn't able to use several of my usual sources for information, so I had to dig onto message boards and other sites that I'm not as confident about their information to get enough details to flesh out the show. I'm just laying that out there up front since I'm well aware I might be dropping some inaccurate knowledge on you today. Arcane Magazine was a UK-published game magazine from Future Publishing that ran from December of 1995 to June of 1997. While it didn't run for a long time, it certainly changed the face of the gaming community while it existed. I can't tell you the number of posts I saw online from readers who praised Arcane for being the magazine it was, which for many meant the ability to get articles on a variety of different role-playing games available on the market. See, by the time Arcane came into existence, White Dwarf had basically been converted into an in-shop advertisement magazine for Games Workshop. Now, that would change in later years, but with one of the most popular magazines at the time going away from non-GW materials, there was a hole created in the game magazine world. That hole was widened a bit later by TSR pulling Dragon Magazine out of the non-TSR game field, which again reduced the number of publications out there covering a variety of different games and companies. And we have to acknowledge that while the internet did exist, it was nowhere near as huge and or prevalent as it is now, and the majority of those using it were on different message boards, sharing their own homebrewed materials or whatever gaming news they'd picked up along the way. I would note for the record that a number of writers for various game magazines used this particular format to gauge interest in articles that would later be published in their own magazines. In other words, if you wanted the juicy stuff, you had to pony up for it. How little things have changed. Reviews from readers at the time marveled at the excellence of Arcane. Readers couldn't get their hands on the magazine fast enough, and for the first year, the sales were quite excellent. So, why did it go away so quickly? Well, the truth just goes back to the concept of good old-fashioned business. I mentioned Future Publishing a moment ago, and they were a rather large media company with a variety of publications, including multiple magazines covering video and computer games. Ultimately, they decided that even though Arcane was selling well, when compared to the other magazines in their portfolio, it just wasn't keeping up. So they shut it down and went back to focusing on their other businesses. In the intervening years, a number of hardcore readers of Arcane have changed their thoughts about the magazine. While they loved it at the time, when they go back and look at them again, many thought that they didn't put the same kind of love and effort into role-playing games that they did into video games. Now, that may be a subjective thought, but when I went online and checked out a couple of issues of Arcane and a couple of issues of the different video game magazines, Arcane did do a pretty good job of discussing games. However, the video game magazines were, in my opinion anyway, better. That being said, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that those magazines had been in print for quite some time and Arcane was still trying to find its footing when it was ultimately canceled. But that's just my opinion, and we all know what they say about opinions. The big question that comes from this is why a poll conducted by a magazine that was only in print for a year and a half is utilized by so many sources in the game world. The answer to that lies partially in the fact that Arcane was considered to be a fairly independent source on games and gaming. I mean, it wasn't beholden to a particular publisher like White Dwarf and Dragon Magazines were. That means if they chose to do a poll, chances are it would be about as fair a poll as you were going to find. Now, there is a downside to that, as you might guess. Since Arcane was published in the UK, the majority of the folks participating in the poll would have been European, probably, and not American. Now, that would be because of the time needed, even in the late 90s, to get foreign materials shipped into the country. I'm not saying that no Americans participated in the poll, because I've got a lot of evidence to the contrary. But I think if the poll had been conducted by an American magazine, we might have seen a different looking list. Now, I'll also admit that after taking all of that into account, this is a fairly impressive looking list they put together. And before we break it down, I do need to remind you that it only consists of games published before the poll was released in December of 1996. So a lot of the games many of you might play and love but were released after that will not be on this list. I'll also try to provide some information on the games I haven't yet covered on the show, though I'm not going to go quite as deep as I would if we were doing an entire show dedicated to the game itself. And some of these games will probably be topics for another show, so there's another reason to not drop too much knowledge on them right now. I'm not going to ignore the games we've already covered, but it's going to be a few words about the game, then a shameless plug for the episode we covered the game in. I mean, I got to drive traffic to the archives somehow, right? Also, I'm only going to name the first company that released the game in cases where multiple publishers are responsible for versions. Otherwise, in some cases, we'd be here all day going over the list. So we'll start with number 50 and work our way down to number 1. Here we go. Number 50 on the poll was 2300 AD. 2300 AD was a science fiction role-playing game originally developed by Games Designers Workshop. And I know we covered at least the basics of it back in our episode on GDW, which was episode 67 back in September. At the time, reviews were split on the game, with some reviewers praising its take on the science fiction genre, while others arguing that there were multiple games in the genre that were better than 2300 AD. At 49 was MechWarrior. Based on the popular video game series BattleTech, MechWarrior was originally released by FASA Corporation in 1986. Again, we touched on MechWarrior in some detail during our episode on FASA, which was episode 61 back in July of last year. Reviewers tended to love the game, especially since it not only allowed for running a role-playing game in the BattleTech universe, but also provided extensive background on that universe, which allowed for a more detailed gaming experience. Number 48 belonged to Dragon Warriors. Dragon Warriors was published by Corgi Books between 1985 and 1986. I say it that way because the game is actually a 6-book series, with the first book being the basic rules and each of the other 5 providing adventures and rules that expanded upon the basic rules from the first book. It's been noted that there was a reprint of these books in 2009, but the originals are highly sought-after collectibles. Dragon Warriors is noteworthy on this list to me because it's one of the few games I've seen rated to this point where Paul Pettingale's comments on the book weren't 100% glowing, and I'll quote him here for context. Quote, "Unfortunately, even though this is a fine, solid system, the format makes it tricky to use and play. Still, it was well received throughout its short life and is highly collectible these days." End quote. Look for us to cover Dragon Warriors in greater detail in a future episode of the podcast. Fighting Fantasy claimed the number 47 spot on the countdown. Published by Puffin Books beginning in 1982, it was the brainchild of Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson. The series consisted of choose-your-own-adventure books, and we covered those in August of last year in episode 64, which covered solo play games. Another game we've covered on the show, at least briefly in the past, is the number 46 entry on the list, James Bond 007. Published between 1983 and 1987, it was designed by Gerard Christopher King and was released by Victory Games, which was an imprint of Avalon Hill. We detailed both the game and Avalon Hill way back in episode 6, which dropped in July of 2021. For those checking the archive, we also detailed Judges Guild, just so you know. Castle Falkenstein drew the number 45 spot in the poll. Developed by Mike Pondsmith and released in 1994 by R. Talsorian Games, it's one of the newer, at the time, games to make the poll. Castle Falkenstein is a steampunk-flavored fantasy game. It was a darling of the critics of the time, though Paul Pettingale noted in his evaluation that it was, quote, either loved or hated by players, end quote. We haven't covered this game or our Talsorian games in an episode yet, so keep your eyes open for us to do so in the near future. At number 44, it's Cyberspace. Originally published in 1989, it was created by Todd Foley and released by Iron Crown Enterprises. These are 2 more topics we've yet to cover on the show, so let's do a quick briefing on the game itself. It's a cyberpunk game running along the lines of Shadowrun. Most of the classes available will be recognizable by players of the latter game, but it's the setting that's different. It takes place in San Francisco in 2090 and plays heavily around the concept of extensive urban sprawl. The 43rd spot on the list was taken by Dark Conspiracy. Designed by Lester Smith and released by Game Designers Workshop in 1991, we didn't cover this game in the GDW episode. It's a near-future horror game, and while that sounds like a great idea on the surface, there were several reviewers who referred to the game's horror elements as unfocused or campy. However, Paul Pettingale's comments in the poll give the overall feelings of much of the gaming world concerning the game itself. Quote, "Players take on the roles of people who have learnt of the evil forces at work in the world and are struggling to defeat them. The evil forces have infiltrated what remains of the government and powerful corporations. A great blend of cyberpunk, Call of Cthulhu, and conspiracy paranoia." End quote. Next up on the list is the number 42 entry, Don't Look Back. Designed by Chuck McGrew and published by Mind Ventures in 1994, DLB is a supernatural and horror game, with mixing the two in gameplay being more in the hands of the GM than the creators. The characters are folks working for a secret government agency investigating supernatural and paranormal events, so the game overall plays like a role-playing game version of the X-Files. Reviews of the first edition ranged from calling it sophomoric to clunky, though later versions of the game have earned stellar reviews. Number 41 on the list belongs to Golden Heroes. Designed by Simon Burley and Peter Haynes, it was originally self-published, which is to say they photocopied the rules and sold them at game shops and conventions on their own. Games Workshop got the license in 1984 and released a more professional and more complete version. It's a superhero game, and while we did 2 episodes on the genre back in March of last year, we didn't cover this one. The reason why is that even though it was an exceptionally popular game at the time, it's long out of print, and most of the gamers that played Golden Heroes have since switched to newer, and in most opinions, better superhero games. No need to dig into a lot of detail here, as Golden Heroes didn't break much new ground in the genre. Clocking in at number 40 is Heroes Unlimited. Designed by Kevin Ciambietta, Carmen Belair, Wayne Bro Jr., Bill Coffin, Kevin Long, and the proverbial cast of dozens, it was released by Palladium Books in 1984. While we covered Palladium Books back in episode 61, which we mentioned a moment ago when we discussed FASA, I don't believe we touched on Heroes Unlimited at the time. Another game in the superhero genre, its claim to fame was that it was marketed as more of a thinking players kind of game, stressing problem solving over beating the crap out of the bad guys. Reviews for the game were stellar, and this is a game you can still buy today, though we're on a much later version. We break into the 30s with HOL, which ranked 39th in the poll. HOL, designed by Todd Shaughnessy, Daniel Thrawn, and Chris Elliott, was released in 1994 by Black Dog Game Factory. HOL is another science fiction game set in the near future, and is another game where humans have colonized areas other than whatever the Earth analog is. In HOL, Earth is called the Human-Occupied Landfill, which is where the HOL comes from. Humans have colonized the entire galaxy, and the overall concept of the game is almost literally kill or be killed. This is definitely a game we'll be covering in long form in a future episode. Next up on our countdown. I'm feeling a lot like Casey Kasem this week. If you don't know who he is, Wikipedia has his name, and then you can YouTube some stuff on him. And quite frankly, if you don't know who he is, that's making me feel a hell of a lot older than I am. So thanks for that. Anyway, back to the countdown. Next up is Top Secret SI, which was ranked at 38. Now, I have to note that Top Secret SI is the third version of what was originally called Top Secret. Top Secret SI was designed by Douglas Niles and released by TSR in 1987. We gave it a mention during the TSR episode back in episode 3, which goes all the way back to June of 2021, but we didn't get into much detail on any of the games during that show. Top Secret SI is designed to be an espionage game where the GM is encouraged to develop their own scenarios to run their players through. TSR supported the game to the hilt at the time, but it was eventually allowed to go out of print. Critics typically compared it to James Bond 007, and while many of them found Bond to be a superior game, mostly due to the non-combat situations, overall Top Secret SI was judged to be a better designed game overall. The next 2 games on the poll are games we've covered both during our timeline episodes at the beginning of this podcast and also in covering their publishing companies. Ghostbusters came in at 37. Based on the exceptionally awesome movie, it was designed by Sandy Peterson, Lynn Willis, and Greg Stafford, and was released by West End Games in 1986, 2 years after the movie came out. The game follows the same premise as the movie, which places the players in the position of paranormal investigators / Ghostbusters. Number 36 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness. Designed by Eric Wuchik and published by Palladium Books, the initial release was in 1985. It was based not on the movies or cartoons, but rather on the comic books, which had been released well before either of those other two came out. The eventual end of the game, as tends to happen in these cases, came when Palladium lost the license. At 35, we come to Twilight 2000. And before some of our younger listeners get too excited, no, this isn't based on those movies. Remember, the poll is 1996 and older games. Designed by Frank Chadwick, Dave Nielsen, Lauren K. Wiseman, and Lester W. Smith, it was released by Games Designers Workshop in 1984. Another post-apocalyptic game, Twilight 2000 picks up after World War III, which included nuclear strikes from the NATO-US side and the Soviet Warsaw Pact side of the war. The players have to pick up the pieces and get on with living, though there are still battles to be fought. One note I wanted to add here is that the system for Twilight 2000 was slightly adjusted by GDW and used for 2300 AD, which we covered earlier in the countdown. Number 34 on the poll belongs to Dream Park. Designed by Mike Poundsmith and released by R. Talsorian Games, Dream Park is based on the 1981 novel Dream Park, which was written by Larry Niven and Stephen Barnes. The premise is that the players are investigating a murder that took place during a LARP in a holographic amusement park. Oh yeah, and the whole thing's being televised. Critics noted that while it was a fun game to run for a couple of sessions or so, they really couldn't imagine trying to run an entire campaign with Dream Park. Still, though, the reviews were quite positive. Werewolf the Apocalypse checks in at number 33 on the poll. We did 3 episodes on the various titles in the World of Darkness line, and Werewolf was covered in the first of these, which was number 55 in June of last year. Created by Mark Ryan-Hagan and published by White Wolf, it was released in 1992. It is, as we've discussed, a horror-based game with the players playing were-creatures of some type. Check out the episodes on the World of Darkness if you want to dive deeper into the game. Tunnels and Trolls is in the 32nd position on the list. We covered this one by request in episode 60, which aired in July of 2022. Designed by Ken St. Andre, it was released by Flying Buffalo Games in 1975. There might be some listeners surprised that Tunnels and Trolls placed as high on the list as it did, but I'd note that at the time of the poll, Tunnels and Trolls was still loved and played worldwide, which, if we're being honest, is still the case today, though maybe by not quite as many people as it was at the time. Tunnels and Trolls is a D&D derivative created because Ken St. Andre wanted a fantasy role-playing game but disliked AD&D. Paul Pettengale noted that the game most likely made the list out of, quote, nostalgia, end quote, because he found it to be, quote, pretty crude, end quote. Ouch. Number 31 goes to Millennium's End. There have been multiple versions of this game published over the years by a number of different companies, but as you'll remember from the start of the show, I'm listing the original versions, as I'm pretty certain these are the ones that were voted onto the poll. That puts me into a bit of a quandary here, since the only information I could dig up on the first version of the game is that it's a techno-thriller set in 1999, and that it was released in 1991 by Chameleon Eclectic Games. So we'll have to use Paul Pettengale's review on the poll to give us an idea of the game. Quote, Millennium's End struggles hard to cut the right balance between fiction and reality, and just manages it. The game system is detailed, but this allows it to model the style of fiction it's based on with more accuracy. Players carry out investigations, espionage, and paramilitary operations, all of which are ably supported. End quote. This is one of those cases where I'll ask that if you know anything more about this game, hit me up on the socials. I'd love to share your knowledge and experiences with our listeners. And of course, I will give you full credit for whatever you share. Rounding out the 30s, we come to Sky Realms of Jorun, which came in at number 30. Designed by Andrew Lecker, his sister Amy, and Miles Tevers, it was published by Sky Realms Publishing, which was formed by Andrew and Miles to take what was originally their high school English assignment and turn it into a role-playing game. They released the game in 1984, and it's a science fantasy game set in a world of their own creation. The sky realms of the game are floating islands on which generations of space travelers have settled. It was influenced by multiple sources, and reviewers of the game were pretty keen on it, though they noted on more than one occasion that the rules were rather disjointed and confusing, and also noted that anyone running the game was going to need a decent amount of experience doing so before taking this game on. At number 29 is a game we just covered a couple of weeks ago, Aftermath. Created by Paul Hume and Robert N. Charette, it was released by Fantasy Games Unlimited in 1981. It's a post-apocalyptic game where characters are basically fighting for all the things they need in order to survive. Again, we just covered this in a semi-long form a couple of weeks ago, so check out episode 83 for all the details. Number 28 brings us Over the Edge. Designed by Robin Laws and Jonathan Tweet, it was released by Atlas Games in 1992. It's set on the island of Al Armaja and is full of secrets and conspiracies, which makes it similar to Vampire the Masquerade in many ways. And that would make sense, since these two worked on that game as well. Over the Edge has the distinction of being the first game to bring the dice pool into gaming, and we've seen that used 100 times at least since then. Reviewers praised the game for its originality, and it proved popular enough to produce multiple editions over the years. Champions checks in next on our list at 27. Designed by Steve Peterson, George McDonald, Bruce Harlich, and Ray Greer, it was released by Hero Games in 1981. Now, I know we covered this at least briefly in one of the 2 superhero episodes we released in March of last year, but let's hit a couple of basics just to be fair. It's based on the Hero system, which is also known as the Champion system, and we've discussed this briefly in several other episodes of the show as well. As you might have guessed, it's a superhero game, but what makes it different from others is that characters' abilities are defined by their effects, which makes it a bit more realistic, or at least gives a feel to the character that better equals what you'd see in a comic book or movie. Reviewers tended to have nice things to say about it, but the average rating for Champions checks in at 3 stars out of 5. At 26, we get Palladium Fantasy Role-Playing Game. Developed by Kevin Ciambietta and most of the development crew at Palladium Books, it was released in 1983. It's Palladium's take on D&D and the D&D world, and since we did an episode breaking this down in detail, I'll leave that episode to speak for the game. For the record, that's episode 69 from September of last year, and we also covered the storytelling system in that show. Number 25 brings us Stormbringer. Created by Ken St. Andre, Lynn Willis, and the proverbial cast of dozens, it was released by Chaosium in 1981. It's a fantasy game, as you might expect from the title, and is based on the Elric novels from Michael Moorcock. Pretty much every review I found for the game was a positive one, with the reviewer stating that if you're a fan of Elric, you should definitely play the game. After all, the title for the game comes from the name of Elric's sword. Fun fact. Earth Dawn is the number 24 game on our list. Designed by Greg Gordon, it was published by FASA in 1993. It, like many of the games on this list, is a fantasy game, but the twist on it is that it acknowledges that all things occurring in nature go through cycles, and magic is one of those things. When magic is high in the world, horrors can cross over into the world. This is where the characters come in, as it's their job to deal with them. Reviewers tended to like the layout of the book, but one reviewer in particular called it, quote, more frosting than cake, end quote. So we're one game past the halfway point. I can tell you with great certainty that this is going to be a long show. Normally when this happens, I split the episode into 2 pieces. This time, though, I'm not going to do that because we've gone way short the past month or so, and I feel like I kind of owe it to you to give you a longer episode. I guess it's time for me to shut up and get back to it. Number 23 on the list goes to Conspiracy X. This is probably the newest game to make the list, as it was released in 1996 by New Millennium Entertainment. It was created by Dave Chapman and George Valsicos and has been described by more than one reviewer as an almost dead-on analog for the X-Files. Needless to say, that means the characters are investigating aliens that have come to Earth and are stirring up their own brand of trouble. I think the reason it rated so high on the list were the reviews. Every review I saw was stellar, ranking between 9 and 10 stars on a 10-star scale. Rick Swan even said in the August 1996 issue of Dragon that, quote, it's the latest in the Aliens Walk Among Us genre and also the best, end quote. Rifts earned number 22 in the poll. Written by Kevin Siembieda and his crew at Palladium Books, it was released in 1990. We covered this game in great detail back in episode 63, which dropped in August of last year, so check that out to hear me gush over the game. GURPS was also a part of that show, and I actually think it was the first game we covered that week, just so you know. Number 21 goes to Judge Dredd. Designed by Mark Gascone and Rick Priestley, it was released by Games Workshop in 1985. The game was based on the hugely popular comic series, which, for those of you who don't know, puts the characters in the position of being judges in a future society. Don't think robes and gavels. Think armor, helmets, and guns, because while you're not necessarily the judge, jury, and executioner, sometimes it's entirely possible you will be. Reviews were 9 to 10 stars across the board, and every review I read recommended it highly. We cracked the top 20 with Space 1889. Designed by Frank Chadwick and published by Game Designers Workshop in 1988, this game can be best described as a Victorian-era steampunk space game. Wow. I realize that's a mouthful, but the basic idea is that many of the scientific ideas of the time that were debunked were actually true, and Thomas Edison invented a method to get people into space. From there, we get into the adventures as these Victorian Earthlings explore space. Both serious science fiction and straight-up tongue-in-cheek farce, Space 1889 got average star reviews, though most critics did say it was fun to play. What they didn't like was that the rules were sort of all over the place, requiring players and GMs to either create house rules on the spot or spend a lot of time trying to find what they needed. Number 19 on the poll goes to Ars Magica. Designed by Mark Reinhagen and Jonathan Tweet, it was released by Lion Rampant Games in 1987. It's set in what's called Mythic Egypt, and if you want to know more about it, we devoted an entire episode to it. That was episode 48 from April of last year. Number 18 on the list is a game that in all my research for this show, I'd never heard of before. Feng Shui. It's designed by Robin Laws, who has a number of games on this poll, and was released by Daedalus Entertainment in 1996. Another game that came out just before the poll was released, Feng Shui earned its spot by being a martial arts game in the style of Hong Kong action movies. Feng Shui plays into the rules because those who have a lot of Feng Shui are considered powerful. The more powerful you are, the more you control. Reviewers across the board praised Feng Shui for taking on the genre, but not falling into the tropes that could have made the game a parody. That being said, though, they also admitted that having some moments of fun and/or comedy were possible when appropriate. Bushido comes in at number 17 on the poll. Designed by Robert N. Charette and Paul R. Hume, it was released by Tier Games in 1979. It's a samurai-flavored game based in feudal Japan. For more on the rules and the system, check out the episode on Fantasy Games Unlimited from just a few weeks ago, as we broke the game down in detail on that show. Number 16 goes to another game we've done a full breakdown for on the show, Mage the Ascension. Designed by the team of Stuart Week, Christopher Early, Stephen Week, Bill Bridges, Sam Chupp, and Andrew Greenberg, it was released by White Wolf Publishing in 1993. Another fine game in the World of Darkness line, mage characters use magic to shape reality. Again, we covered this in great detail during the 3 episodes we did on the various titles in the World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness, so check those out for more details. Rollmaster checks into our poll at number 15. Created by Coleman Charlton, John Curtis, Pete Fenlon, and Steve Marvin, it was released by Iron Crown Enterprises in 1980. It's a fantasy role-playing game, but beyond that, it's almost a full-on system of its own. Over the years, around 50 different books and supplements have been published for the games, and reviewers have found it to be a complex system, but in a good way. Across the board, the game was recommended, though with the warning that you'd better be on your A game if you were going to run it or play it. GURPS picked up the 14th spot on our poll. Designed by Steve Jackson and published by Steve Jackson Games in 1985, GURPS isn't so much a game as it is an entire game system, as the rules provided can be used for whatever genre of game you want to play. We expanded on GURPS back in episode 63 in August of last year. We head back to the World of Darkness for the 13th game on our list, Wraith the Oblivion. Created by Mark Reinhagen, Sam Chupp, and Jennifer Hartshone, it was published by White Wolf Publishing in 1994. Now, Wraith is darker than most of the other games in the line, as it covers a very dark afterlife for the characters playing. This one was also covered in long form during the 3 episodes on the World of Darkness games, so check them out for more details. By the way, as we move higher and higher up this list, you'll notice we're running into more and more games that we've already covered on the show. However, there's going to be one on here that's going to shock you, and that's because somehow we haven't covered it in long form yet. Getting back to the poll, Pendragon is number 12. Designed by Greg Stafford and published by Chaosium in 1985, Pendragon is the ultimate medieval game of chivalry and Arthurian legend I've seen yet. And is it obvious I really dig this game? We covered it about as extensively as possible way back in December of 2021 in episode 31, and you can hear me fanboy over it if you check out that show. Number 11 on the countdown goes to Middle-earth Roleplaying. Designed by Coleman Charlton and published by Iron Crown Enterprises in 1985, it's based on, you guessed it, Lord of the Rings. I don't think that requires much more of an explanation than that, but we did try to back in December of 2021 when we covered games based on literature, so you can check out that episode and see how we did. It's time to get into the top 10, and we begin with Cyberpunk. Designed by Mike Poundsmith and published by R. Talsorian Games in 1988, Cyberpunk can be best described as a dystopian science fiction game. Poundsmith has stated he was influenced by Blade Runner, and it shows in the finished product. We covered Cyberpunk in great detail back in episode 60, which came out in July of last year, so check that out for a deeper explanation of the game. Number 9 goes to Star Wars D6. Now, the actual name of the game was Star Wars the Role-Playing Game, but since there have been several other Star Wars games released since then, the source I used for the poll used the D6 designation so as not to confuse folks. Designed by Greg Kostikian and released by West End Games in 1987, this version of the game not only provided role players with their first opportunity to play in the actual Star Wars universe, but it also influenced Timothy Zahn when he wrote novels to expand the universe back in the 90s. We've touched on the game twice, and we did it in back-to-back episodes. Episode 23 covered all of the Star Wars games, along with Star Trek, and came out the last week of October in 2021, while episode 24 covered West End Games and Greg Kostikian specifically. Check out both of these shows for more details on this particular game. At number 8, we get Shadowrun. Look, in my opinion, this is the best cyberpunk game out there, but I know there are those who will disagree with me to the point of near violence. It's my opinion, and we know what they say about opinions. It was designed by a huge team, which included Robert N. Charette, Paul Hume, Tom Dowd, L. Ross Babcock III, Sam Lewis, Dave Wiley, and Mike Mulvill, among others. It was released by FASA in 1989. Look, I could fanboy this game more here, but since I did an entire episode on it back in August of 2021, why not check that out? For those keeping score at home, it's episode 22. The hits that landed in the top 10 just keep on coming, as Paranoia landed at number 7. Designed by Greg Kostikian, Dan Gelber, Eric Goldberg, and Alan Varney, it was released by West End Games in 1984. A dystopian future game, Paranoia took itself in a totally different direction, with the opportunity for serious comedy, as well as serious total party kills, always being in play. As I've said multiple times in the past few minutes, and we'll be saying several more times before the show ends, we did an entire episode on this game, and it's number 25 from November of 2021. Landing just outside the top 5 is Vampire the Masquerade. The originator of the World of Darkness, it was designed by Mark Ryan-Hagan, Graham Davis, Tom Dowd, Lisa Stevens, and Stuart Week. White Wolf Publishing handled the release, and it first published in 1991. Not only did Vampire launch the World of Darkness, it also brought the storytelling system into the tabletop role-playing world. Vampire was covered in the first of the 3 episodes we did on the World of Darkness, and the storytelling system got an episode of its own as well. That's episode 69 from September of last year. Okay, so if Vampire, Shadowrun, Star Wars, and Paranoia didn't make the top 5, which games did? I'm sure you've already guessed at least one of them, but I think there's a couple here you didn't guess. Number 5 goes to RuneQuest. Designed by Steve Perrin, Ray Tunney, Steve Henderson, Warren James, and basing the entire location on the design of Greg Stafford, Chaosium handled the publishing, releasing the game in 1978. RuneQuest is most definitely a fantasy role-playing game, and characters in its world are divided into those who cast magic and those who don't. Look, we've got this slated for its own episode coming up, so I don't want to spoil it. Let's just say one of the features of RuneQuest is the setting that Stafford designed, which is way better detailed than some of the settings designed by Wizards of the Coast over the past decade or so. Yeah, I know, that really wouldn't take much, but this is really, really good. Number 4 on the list kind of surprised me, but in a good way. Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing took this spot. Designed by Richard Hallowell, Rick Priestley, Graham Davis, Jim Bambra, and Phil Gallagher, it was released by Games Workshop in 1986. It was designed to be a companion piece to the Warhammer miniature wargaming system Games Workshop already owned and developed. The role-playing game took on a life of its own and obviously became popular enough in a 10-year span to jump past a lot of really good games and nail down this spot in the poll. If you want to know how that's possible, check out episode 40 from February of last year. We gave WFRP an entire episode to prove why we think it's a damn good game. Number 3 on the list goes to Traveler, one of the oldest games on this list. It was released in 1977 by Games Designers Workshop and was designed by Mark Miller, Frank Chadwick, John Harshman, and Lauren Wiesen. It's a science fiction exploration game with characters exploring space, getting into space battles, negotiating with aliens, and all the types of adventures you'd expect from the genre. Difference is, Traveler did it better than anyone else, in my opinion. And obviously it was the opinion of a hell of a lot of other folks here as well. We hit on Traveler during the first 2 timeline episodes of the show, which are episodes 4 and 5 from June of 2021, and we touched on it in the GDW episode, which is number 67 from September of last year. All right, 2 spots left. Number 2 goes to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Yeah, I know, right? Credited to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the first edition of AD&D dropped in 1977. Look, I don't think we need to say much else about the game here since we've covered it multiple times during the show. On top of that, I'd say it's safe to assume that the large majority of you know AD&D quite well. For those who don't, episodes 2 and 3 from June of 2021, episodes 12 and 13 from August of 2021, and episode 26 from November of 2021 all cover this edition in some form, with episode 26 being the AD&D first edition deep dive. So if AD&D wasn't number 1, who in the hell was? This is the game I'm embarrassed to say I haven't covered in long form yet on the podcast. At number 1, it's Call of Cthulhu. Designed by Sandy Peterson and published by Chaosium, Call of Cthulhu was released in 1981. Based on the Cthulhu mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft, Call of Cthulhu is considered by pretty much every gamer out there to be the horror game of horror games. And if it isn't, it's probably because they've never played it before. I covered the game a little bit back in episode 5, which was a timeline episode, but we'll need a full episode to really break down what makes Cthulhu special. I mean, the chance of going completely mad at pretty much any point in the game is a pretty good starting point. But there's so much more to it. It really does deserve an episode of its own. And that's the list. Those are the 50 games considered to be the best games of all time as of 1996. For those who were gaming at the time, do you agree with this list? Are there games you would have put on the list that didn't make it? And would you change the order? I can tell you this, over the past couple of decades, there have been a lot of discussion and argument over the order of the top 10, especially where it concerns the positioning of AD&D and Cthulhu. But that's an argument for another time. Why? Because we've come to the end of today's tour. Special thanks go out this week to the various internet posters who've kept the Arcane Magazine poll alive for all of us to see. Their postings are filled with commentary as well as the poll, so be ready for a long read if you go to check them out. Next week, I right the wrong I just admitted to and cover Call of Cthulhu in long form. In the meanwhile, I'd ask you to check out our other podcast, Bad GM's Campaign Build-Along. This week, we're building the third of 3 jobs on our group's job board, and if time permits, we'll start laying out the groundwork for the group to get retribution to try to right a wrong that they found about in the last episode. Bad GM's Campaign Build-Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or from our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your royalty-free, license-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. Check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/gaming/badgmprod, on Twitter at badgmp, YouTube and Tumblr, Bad GM Productions. You can email us, badgmproductions@gmail.com, and our website, again, is badgmproductions.net. I'd encourage you to check out our Facebook page, YouTube channel, and website, as we've been posting exclusive videos to all three over the past few weeks. Some of the videos expand on topics we've covered on the podcasts, but some of our stuff is brand new and exclusive to the site it's posted on. And if you've got requests for video topics, hit us up, and if we can make it happen, you know we will. Next week, we step into the Lovecraftian world of Call of Cthulhu. Get ready to lose your frickin' mind. But that's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History. I hope you enjoyed this week's trip in the Wayback Machine, and while I strive to put out new content each and every week, I'm not opposed to doing a few more of these along the way, though if I do it again, I want your input for what you'd like to hear. You know where to hit me up, so feel free to do so. Next week, I promise we've got a new episode, and it'll be the year-end show, which gives me the opportunity to use my old reporter muscles, since we're going to do a role-playing game news review for 2023. In the meantime, check out Bad GM's campaign Build-Along. We're doing a Megasode for that show as well this week, and we're stringing together the first 3 episodes of Season 2, so that you can have all of the building we did before we ever wrote a word of the scenario. We'll do it all in one show. Bad GM's campaign Build-Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or from our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We've got a presence on pretty much every social media site out there. So if you want to know where you can follow us, check the info box for this week's episode or the website. That's badgmproductions.net. Next week, we close out 2023 by taking a look back at the role-playing game industry as a whole for the past year. That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.